First, I must express my thanks to Dr. Popova for inviting me and to the Academy for hosting us today in this wonderful hall, seat of learning and scholarship. I very much hope it's not the last time we'll find ourselves here. Just give a bit of background. In 2008, I published a paper with a series of papers published by the Institute called, what was it called? It was on Russian scholarly relations in the early part of the 20th century. And I talked broadly then about the scholarly links between Russia and the UK. It was called Scholarly Respect in an Age of Political Rivalry. Following this, Professor Wang Ching from Lanzhou University, who's an authority on the Oral Stein archives and has worked on them for over 2 decades, carried out research specifically on correspondence in the Stein archives relating to Oldenburg. And he gave a paper on this at, I think, the 2009 conference at the Institute, a preliminary study of the correspondence between Stein and Oldenburg. Just go back. He subsequently prepared a paper for publication in Chinese, but we've since decided we will prepare a joint publication bringing together both our pieces of research over the past few years. But I'm heavily indebted to Professor Wang Ching for sharing his research, and much of his work informs my talk today. Okay. So both our papers drew exclusively on the archives from Oral Stein in the Bodleian Library in Oxford and George McCartney in various archives in the British Library and elsewhere. I had the opportunity yesterday to look at some of the archives here at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I must express thanks to my colleagues here. But many of you might know other relevant sources, and this is a work in progress, so please do, if you know of other places where we can find information on this topic, please let me know, as we would like it to inform our paper. So let us start with Oldenburg and Stein, the subject of the talk today. Well, we all know about Oldenburg, because we've heard lots about him from the speakers up today. He was born in 1863, so he was born within a year of Stein. They were near contemporaries. Both had a pan-European education and grew up in that era of pan-European interest in matters Oriental, which was signified, of course, by the establishment of the Oriental Congress, which held its first meeting in Paris in 1873, while both Stein and Oldenburg were but still in their youth. In fact, both men claimed that it was in their youth that they became inspired to think about working on the Orient. Stein had read Alexander the Great and Oldenburg a book about Tibet, and both say in their memoirs that it was those childhood readings that got them started. Stein's imagination, of course, had also been caught by Rudyard Kipling's evocative opening chapter in his book Kim, with its account of the Gandhara art at the museum in Lahore, where Stein later was to work and where he was to become friends with Lockwood Kipling, Rudyard's father. And Oldenburg also had a link in this way. He was to translate Rudyard Kipling's short stories into Russian, I believe. I don't know if it's still in print. Both men spent time in Britain from 1885, and both mixed with the several British scholars who were working on matters Oriental, and several of whom were members of the Indian Council. For Stein, this was most notably Sir Henry Yule, who was a member of the Indian Council and who, as such, was in part responsible for getting Stein his post in Lahore. We have to remember that Stein at this time was Hungarian born. He took British nationality in the early 1900s, so he adopted Britain as his home, although living in British India for most of his life. The earliest correspondence we have between Stein and Oldenburg is 1903, or that I've managed to find so far, but we can be fairly certain that they met during this earlier time in Britain, as Oldenburg's name appears in the address book which Stein started using in 1884. And it would have been surprising, really, if they hadn't met at this time. I haven't been able to find in place of their original meeting, but we could expect to find that it was at a gathering of the house of one of the members of the Indian Council. Many of them lived in an area of London called Earl's Court, which is in the west of London, West Kensington, and Stein at the time called this place Little India because of the number of scholars working on India who lived there. Or perhaps they met at a meeting of one of the learned societies that were established in the late 18th and 19th centuries throughout Europe, and that have played such a part in promoting scholarship in this area, and to which we're all indebted. If they did not meet at this time, then they certainly met at the 1897 11th Congress in Paris, where they both gave papers, or they both attended. And as I discussed in my previous paper, this and the 1899 Rome Congress of Oriental Studies were instrumental in bringing Central Asian exploration and scholarship to the centre of the Orientalist agenda at the time. At the Rome Congress, as I'm sure some speakers have alluded to, Oldenburg spoke on the manuscripts acquired by Petrovsky from Khotan. And Oldenburg was also confirmed as a member of the International Proprietary Committee on Central Asian Exploration. At this time, of course, Stein's mentor and great scholar, then principal of the Calcutta Madrasa, Rudolf Hernley, was engaged in trying to decipher a similar set of manuscripts that had been acquired by the British consul, Petrovsky's colleague, in Kashgar, also from Khotan, sold to him by a man called Islam al-Khun. So they were both acquiring these manuscripts at the same time. The story is so well known by now. I think I have a picture of the manuscript. There you go. This is one acquired sold to McCartney by Islam al-Khun. But this story is so well known, I'm only going to refer to it. And here's Islam al-Khun. Of course, Stein in 1901 unmasked this man as a forger and showed that all the manuscripts sold to McCartney by Islam al-Khun and his colleagues to Petrovsky were forgeries. And then he had to break this news to his mentor, Hernley, and subsequently published details in his report of his first expedition, Ancient Khotan. And this might explain Stein's annotation on the first letter I know about from Oldenburg to Stein, which is dated 13th of September 1903. This was after Stein's return on his first trip to Central Asia in 1900 to 1901. In this letter from Oldenburg says, "I'm awaiting with impatience for the appearance of your large report, Ancient Khotan, having postponed the publication of my description of the Petrovsky Khotan collection." And in fact, Stein highlights this in red and puts several exclamation marks after it, perhaps alluding to the fact that, of course, a lot of these Khotanese manuscripts, not all of them, of course, were found to be forgeries. Just something here which colleagues might be able to help me on. In this letter, Oldenburg addresses, the address he gives, where he sends the letter from, is Iver. I know there's a town in eastern Russia with this name, but Oldenburg writes that he's writing from a town in central Russia, a small town in central Russia. So some of you might be able to tell me where that is, or if I've got the transcription incorrect. Following on from this, there are 24 letters in the correspondence that we've found so far, but this is not a complete archive. As Wang Jijing has pointed out, there are references to other letters written but not yet found, and also copies of letters that are clearly replies to previous unknown correspondence. By this time, Oldenburg is also in regular correspondence with many other scholars in Britain, and I should mention just two, notably Cecil Bendel and F.W. Thomas. Of course, he was also in regular correspondence with many other European, Indian and Japanese scholars, but my colleagues today are going to talk about these. But it is worth saying that Stein considered himself a member of an international, wider scholarly community. And in a recent study on Russian Orientalism, David van der Ooy suggests that Oldenburg was similarly inclined, as indeed were, I would say, many of the scholars in Europe and elsewhere at that time, David Van Doy says, like his mentor Baron Rosen, Oldenburg saw himself as a member of the European scholarly community rather than a strictly Russian one. And this, I think, informed all the relationships between all these scholars over the next decades. I will just give a very, very brief preview of these other two contacts that I mentioned, Bendel and Thomas here, because they're the subject of other papers, but I just want to show the wide links that Oldenburg had with scholars in Britain. His collaborative nature and his respect for international colleagues is shown by his choice of Cecil Bendel, 1856 to 1906, who was formerly at the Department of Oriental Manuscripts and Printed Books at the British Museum, the Foundation Collection of the British Library, and since 1895 had been Professor of Sanskrit at University College London. And Oldenburg asked Bendel to edit the first volume of his new series, Bibliotheca Pudica. Bendel had a copious correspondence with Oldenburg from at least 1895. The first letter in the archives here is dated in 1896, but mentions a letter sent the previous September in 1895. And throughout 1896, Bendel bombards Oldenburg with tiny little postcards, with tiny little script about all the proof changes to this manuscript that they're working on. There are at least 15 such postcards, and they continue through 1895, 1896 into 1897, with Bendel becoming increasingly impatient and getting increasingly desperate, obviously, at the wish to get this book out. And we must consider at the time that these postcards are going backwards and forwards every few days and obviously reaching the recipient between London, Oxford, St Albans, Cambridge, and St Petersburg, Leningrad was there. And also at the same time going backwards and forwards are proofs of manuscripts. And although, for example, on 30th of March, 6th of March 1897, Bendel writes, "I've had no proofs for nearly a month. Please do not let them go to sleep again." And then at the end of the month, another week gone by of no proofs. Even though he's writing these replies, it shows the fact that they could rely on the post to get proofs and letters back, and so they could work in a European way, in a pan-European way. I think we often forget. Well, looking at Bendel's postcards, I think he would have been a very good email correspondent because he uses postcards like somebody might use emails, whereas Stein is much more of a letter writer with lots of formalities and pleasantries. Bendel just gets down to the fact immediately, and he would have loved to have been in touch with Oldenburg and would have, by email, would have undoubtedly be sending emails 10 times a day instead of one postcard every 3 days. The book does come along, and by May, Bendel's obviously relaxing a bit more and is a bit more placatory. I'm sorry to give you so much trouble, especially if, though I hope this is no longer so, your health is not quite first rate. And in fact, although their relationship starts as a professional one, working on this edition, it's allied increasingly with a friendship and respect, and this comes across in even these brief postcards. Bendel mentions and asks after Oldenburg's ill health several times. "I am grieved that you are still unwell" in October 1896. And in spring 1901, several postcards are sent to a health sanatorium in Switzerland, which I believe Oldenburg was visiting for his son, whose son was ill health. In late 1896, Bendel tries to persuade Oldenburg to stay in his chambers near the museum, in his house, flat near the museum, while Oldenburg is visiting London. Bendel himself is away in Tunisia. And again in 1901, he hopes that Oldenburg will come to England on his way back from Switzerland. At which time, he says, he hopes that de la Vallée-Poussin, famous scholar, will also be in London to give a talk. I find it rather amusing that in his postcard, he writes to Oldenburg, in brackets, in French, exclamation mark, "Are we not cosmopolitan?" at the Royal Asiatic Society, which perhaps is proof of the lack of cosmopolitanism of that time. But he says in that card, where he's trying to get Oldenburg to come to Britain on his way back from the sanatorium in Switzerland, "It would be capital if you both," him and Donna Valley Poussin, stayed here in St Albans together. St Albans is where Bendel lived at the time. And we can all dig together in the India Office archives. Their correspondence continues into 1901 and 2 when Bendel moves to Cambridge to teach Sanskrit. And again, shows the range of respect and dependency scholars developed in each other. When he applies for the professorship of Sanskrit at Cambridge, he writes to Oldenburg asking for a few lines of support. And in fact, this time he writes on a rather nice letter-headed paper for the first time. Obviously, the asking him a favour required something more formal than a little scrawled postcard. And he says, as a rule, I'm not asking men of our age and standing to write anything in my favour, but you are the doyen of Sanskrit in Russia, and moreover, you know my work, so please write a few lines of appreciation. This is not empty praise. It's clear by this time that Oldenburg had gained the respect of the British and indeed cross-European community of scholars. It's just one of many instances we could show of this sort of comment. However, by September 1903, Bendel has not heard from Oldenburg for some time, and he writes on the 18th of September, "My dear friend, it is indeed an age since I have had news of you, indirect or direct. Best wishes, let us hear from you. My wife joins in kind regards." But in fact, this is the last letter from Bendel in the files, and he died in 1906, so I don't know whether their correspondence continued or not. I should add that Bendel, like all the other scholars of this time, was effusive, not only his praise for Oldenburg, but also for the Academy. And he writes, for example, in this first volume, "I wish to express my gratitude to the outstanding Academy, which has done so much for the studies of the Orient, for the honour of being appointed editor of the first volume." Moving on quickly, very, very quickly, I'm going to mention very quickly F.W. Thomas, 1857 to 1956, who was also a near contemporary of Oldenburg, librarian of the India Office Library, and after that Bowdoin Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford. And Thomas worked very, very closely with Stein, most especially on Tibetan manuscripts. And his extant correspondence starts with Oldenburg, starts in 1900. And in fact, again, it's a very practical correspondence, born of a practical need, the borrowing of manuscripts which came from India, from the India Office Library, was sent to Leningrad and studied by scholars there. And this sort of flight of manuscripts was going on throughout Europe. They were just sent by post, delivered back after a year or 2 years or 3 years. And in fact, many of Thomas's letters to Oldenburg relate to the late delivery, the late return of the manuscripts he's borrowed. It's quite astonishing to think of this now in an age of such caution about the collections. Unlike Stein, Thomas actually visited Oldenburg in St. Petersburg. He writes on 22nd of October, "Of the most pleasant time I spent there, I hope it is not the last." Thomas's letters after this time also contain news and gossip, and wishes that Oldenburg will visit, and Oldenburg did indeed in 1910. There's a large gap, as we see in many cases, in correspondence between 1912 and 1926, but then it continues. And the last note I found is a postcard from Thomas sending Oldenburg New Year greetings in 1931, which of course was shortly, not long before his death. Just one little note which I thought all of us would, sorry I put a typo in there, all of us would appreciate. Thomas writes when trying to persuade Oldenburg to stop over in Britain, "You must come over as soon as you can manage it. We must all the time neglect some of our duties, strictly speaking, must we not, if we are to continue fit to perform them. There is a duty towards those who would like to see you in Berlin, Paris and London." And this is a continuing theme throughout all this correspondence, is the continuing frustration that these scholars, although they're in constant correspondence, are actually not seeing each other as nearly as much as they would like. Just returning to Stein very, very briefly, just to finish off their relationship over this time. And of course, Stein saw scholars perhaps even less than many others, because he was based in British India and travelling on the in Chinese Central Asia and then Iran and Iraq for so many years of his life. In 1917, Stein and Oldenburg did meet at the same time in 1910 as Oldenburg came over and met Thomas, and there's effusive thanks and pleasure at having met. There's not much correspondence until the 1920s, but in 1917 there are several letters concerning Professor Ivanov, Persianist and assistant keeper of Oriental manuscripts at the Asiatic Museum under Oldenburg, who went to Central Asia to collect manuscripts. I discussed this in my previous paper, so won't expand to say here, except to say that starting in this period, we see a period where, we were in a period, I think, in the early part of the decades of the 20th century where European politics had relatively little negative influence on Central Asian scholarship. But of course, the situation started to change. And even though few of the scholars' letters refer directly to the changing political situation, it can be read between the lines. And clearly, this was clearly shown in, again, my previous paper when a different paper, when I addressed the increasing spectre, for example, of the rise of Mussolini and fascism in Italy and the correspondence between Stein and Count Filippo de Filippi and their concern over helping a young scholar in the 1930s find employment outside, a young Jewish scholar outside Italy. Stein continues to lobby for Professor Ivanov, who is outside Russia and doesn't feel he can go back after 1917, but to little avail, he did not return to Russia. And as I explained in the previous paper, Stein spent some time and effort getting him posted, some work in London and then in Calcutta. As I concluded in my previous paper, much as the scholars might have tried to transcend his concerns, politics was never out of the picture in the story of the exploration of Chinese Central Asia, nor indeed in their private lives. But most, such as Stein and Oldenburg, managed to avoid letting political competition taint their scholarly collaboration, and theirs was a relationship of respect. Just quickly, the most of the remaining front letters between Oldenburg and Stein date from 1923 to 1926 and clearly show this respect. In 1923, Oldenburg is staying in Paris, and Stein writes from his Kashmiri mountain, and writes to Stein via his Kashmiri mountain camp. Stein writes back and expresses the hope that Oldenburg will publish the results of his explorations in Dunhuang. I'm greatly pleased to learn of the abundant results which our visit to Dunhuang has borne and shall look forward with keenest interest to their publication. I have long learned to appreciate fully the unfailing thoroughness of all your investigations and know how much room there was left for them at many a site. This is our hope, of course, the publication of Oldenburg's work on Dunhuang, that our Chinese colleagues realised finally with their translation and publication, but that we, the rest of us European scholars, are still awaiting for, and of course the typescript is shown in a nice display in the Hermitage, which I'm sure most of you have seen or will see. After this, Stein's letters start to show a subtle concern for Oldenburg's position. For example, in 1925, he writes, "It's truly comforting and encouraging for all fellow students to know that you're still occupying that leading position in the academy, which has enabled you in the past to do so much for the studies we have at heart. May it become easy for you to exercise the same beneficent influence also thereafter." Of course, as we know, it wasn't so simple. And he also expresses a similar sentiment to Stein as Bendel to the position of the academy. Permit me to take this occasion for expressing my sincere respect for the great services rendered by your academy to those Oriental studies which I am interested, and indeed in Oldenburg share by your own personal labours in the field. They meet, I said, in Paris, and both are very effusive in their greetings about that. And then they meet again in 1929. Sorry, that letter relates to, I think, to the 1929 meeting. Delightfully stimulating hours spent in your company. My short visit to Paris will always be cherished by me very gratefully. And in fact, Oldenburg replies saying, I hope it was not our last meeting, so sincerely, au revoir in old friendship. Just one final point. It's interesting because at this time, Oldenburg is starting to question the usefulness of the congresses of Orientalists, which of course have been going since 1873, but he feels they're getting rather too large, rather diffuse, and they're not useful. He says the congresses, as they're managed to do, give no satisfaction. And he lays out a whole series of suggestions as to how they may be improved for the next one. For example, saying a few important questions should be treated in each section by the best specialists, and asks Stein advice. Personally, I concur with his opinion, and I'm delighted to be speaking at a conference which is so nicely focused and which is surrounded by colleagues, distinguished international colleagues working on a particular topic where we can make a lot of progress. So it's clear from Oldenburg's correspondence with Stein that theirs was a relationship of respect and genuine friendship, as well as scholarship, despite the fact they managed to meet so infrequently and had such an intermittent correspondence. I feel it's appropriate to end on Stein's words, sent to Oldenburg just a few months before his death. The letter was sent in December 1933 on the celebrations of 50 years of Oldenburg's work. And he writes, he's writing from Bushire and Gulf, but you may feel assured that none of us who know the abundant results and high value of your scholarly labours could take a more sincere share in these celebrations than I do now from far away in the Persian Gulf. I consider it truly a great piece of good fortune that it was given to a scholar of your wide attainments and of your indefatigable keenness to make use of the abundant materials collected in your country for Oriental research.